The morning air in the district didn't dare to stir as the black sedans came to a halt. Mr. Han stepped out, the sharp crease of his tailored lavender suit catching the early sun like a polished blade. He didn't just walk, he owned the pavement, each step of his designer shoes echoing against the cobblestones with the finality of a gavel. Behind him, Jean, a mountain of a man in a black suit and dark sunglasses, stood as an immovable shadow, his eyes scanning the crowd for threats that usually disappeared before Han even glanced their way. To the people of the city, the lavender suit was a warning. It was the color of a man who didn't need to wear black to be feared, a man so confident in his ruthlessness that he could stand out in any crowd and remain untouched. As he moved through the public square, the atmosphere curdled. Shopkeepers who had been laughing moments before suddenly found themselves intensely interested in their floorboards. Pedestrians veered off their paths, creating a wide, hollow circle around the small procession. Even the casual onlookers, like a middle-aged man in a red shirt passing by, slowed his pace, sensing the sudden shift in the air, the heavy, electric weight of absolute authority. Han checked his gold watch, the metal gleaming against his skin, his expression a mask of bored, calculated control. He was a man who viewed the city as a series of numbers and assets to be managed, a kingdom built on the cold logic of profit and power. He wanted for nothing because he took everything he desired. His only flaw was the very thing that made him successful, a heart that had become as sterile and unyielding as the skyscrapers he owned. He was halfway across the square when the rhythm of his morning was broken. Jin's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, his posture turning rigid as a small, gray blur broke the invisible perimeter that kept the world at bay. Han didn't flinch, he simply stopped. The city seemed to hold its breath as a young girl in a simple, worn dress stood her ground against the most dangerous man in the city. The Iron Boss looked down, his guarded eyes meeting the serious, tear-streaked face of the child, unaware that his world of logic was about to be dismantled by a single, trembling hand. Jin's reaction was instantaneous, a practiced reflex honed by years of surviving the city's back alleys. As the small figure in the gray dress darted from the mouth of a nearby alleyway, Jin stepped forward, his broad shoulders squaring to form a human wall. His hand dipped toward the concealed holster beneath his black blazer, his jaw tightening into a line of iron. To the bodyguard, there were no children, only variables. And any variable that breached the perimeter was a threat to be neutralized. The onlooker in the red shirt froze, sensing the lethal tension radiating from the giant in sunglasses. "Stay back," Jin's voice rumbled, a low warning that usually sent grown men running in the opposite direction. But Yumi didn't run. She stood her ground on the uneven cobblestones, her small frame looking impossibly fragile against the backdrop of the towering buildings and the armed men who patrolled them. Her dress was a dull, dusty gray, worn at the hem and far too thin for the morning chill, yet her posture remained remarkably straight. Her hair was pulled back neatly, revealing a face that was tense and serious, carrying a weight that no 6-year-old should understand. In her outstretched hands, she held a single, crumpled piece of paper, a $5 bill, damp with the sweat of her palms. Jin took another step, his shadow falling over her like an eclipse, but before he could reach out to physically remove her, a sharp, cold command cut through the air. "Stand down, Jin." The bodyguard paused mid-stride, his head tilting back toward his boss in disbelief. Mr. Han hadn't moved. He stood perfectly still in his lavender suit, his golden chain catching the light as he looked down at the intruder. There was no anger in his gaze, only a piercing, guarded curiosity that seemed to strip away the girl's defenses. He had seen assassins with more hesitation than this child. The square fell into a vacuum of silence. Han ignored the stares of the public and the confusion of his men, his focus narrowing entirely on the girl in gray. He saw the way her fingers trembled against the money, and the way her eyes remained lowered, not out of fear, but out of a desperate, focused reverence. She was offering him a pittance, yet she held it as if it were the crown jewels. Intrigued by the sheer defiance of his own reputation, Han slowly began to lower himself, the expensive fabric of his trousers stretching as he knelt on the dirty street to meet her at eye level. The scent of expensive cologne mingled with the grit of the street as Mr. Han descended to Yumi's level. His knees pressed into the hard cobblestones, a gesture of submission to her height that sent a ripple of murmurs through the watching crowd. Up close, the girl looked even smaller, her face a map of exhaustion and silent resolve. She didn't look at his gold watch or the shimmering lavender silk of his sleeves, she looked only at his eyes. "You're the boss, right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of city traffic. "The one everyone is afraid of?" Han's expression remained a mask of iron, though a flicker of something, perhaps a long-buried memory, softened the corners of his gaze. "People say many things, little one," he replied, his tone surprisingly steady. "Why are you looking for me?" With a trembling breath, Yumi extended her arms fully, offering the crumpled $5 bill as if it were a sacred contract. The paper was soft from being folded and refolded 100 times. "I want to hire you," she said, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "My teacher says you're the strongest man in the world. That you can make anyone do anything." Han looked at the money, then back at her. To a man who dealt in millions, the $5 note was less than a rounding error, yet he found himself unable to look away from it. He could see the faint traces of dirt under her fingernails and the way her simple gray dress hung loosely on her frame. This wasn't a joke or a distraction, it was a desperate transaction. $5 is a lot of money," Han said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual lethal edge. "What kind of job requires the strongest man in the world?" Yumi's lower lip quivered, but she didn't let the tears fall. She stepped closer, her small shoes clicking softly against the stone until she was inches from his face. She leaned in, her secret ready to be unburdened, while Jean watched from behind, his hand still hovering near his jacket, realizing that his boss was currently engaged in the most dangerous deal of his career. The silence of the square deepened as Yumi leaned in, her small hand cupping her mouth to ensure the secret reached only his ears. Mr. Han remained perfectly still, a statue in lavender, as the girl's warm breath brushed against his cheek. She spoke with a desperate, shaky cadence, her words tumbling out like a confession. "My mommy doesn't come home anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her reality. "She stays at the big building with the gray smoke. She says the men there are mean, and they won't let her sleep until the clothes are all finished. She cries every night because her hands hurt so much she can't even hold me." Han's eyes narrowed, his mind already cataloging the properties in the industrial district. He knew the building she was describing, it was the Han Garment Export Center, a facility that had been reporting record-breaking profits for 3 consecutive quarters. He had praised the managers for their efficiency and overhead reduction in his last board meeting, never once considering the human cost behind the rising line on his ledger. "She told me the boss is the king of this city," Yumi continued, her whisper growing more urgent as a single tear finally escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "She said you're the only one who can make the bad men stop. Please, Mr. Boss. Take my $5 and tell them to let my mommy come home. Tell them she's tired." The words hit Han with a force no physical blow ever had. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw the direct result of his own calculated indifference. The Iron Boss wasn't just a spectator to this child's suffering, he was the architect of it. The predatory system he had refined to ensure his empire's dominance was the very monster that was stealing this girl's mother. Jean, standing just feet away, noticed the subtle tightening of Han's jaw and the way his hand, resting on his knee, began to tremble. It was a lapse in composure that the bodyguard had never witnessed in a decade of service. Han looked down at the crumpled $5 bill in his palm, the paper feeling heavier than a bar of gold. He realized in that moment that his soul had been bought, not by a rival or a king, but by a child who had no idea she was handing a contract to the very man who had signed her mother's misery into existence. The heavy silence that had descended upon the square felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the onlookers who watched the impossible scene unfold. Mr. Han, the man who held the city's lifeblood in his iron grip, remained on his knees in the dust, his lavender suit, a symbol of untouchable status, staining against the grit of the cobblestones. He looked at the crumpled $5 bill in his palm, then back at Yumi, whose tear-filled eyes held a hope so pure it made his throat tighten with a sudden, unfamiliar ache. Slowly, Han's fingers closed over the money, the paper rustling softly as he tucked it into the breast pocket of his jacket, right over his heart. It was the smallest payment he had ever received, yet the transaction felt more binding than any multi-million-dollar merger he had ever signed. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The man in the red shirt stopped completely, his mouth agape at the sight of the city's most dangerous predator showing such profound deference to a child in a worn gray dress. Jean, standing behind them, felt the air shift. He recognized that look in Han's eyes. The cold, calculated focus was still there, but it was no longer aimed at profit. It was aimed at a debt that money could never settle. "The contract is accepted, Yumi," Han said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs of the square. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he gently wiped a stray tear from the girl's cheek with his thumb. "I will go to the building with the gray smoke. I will tell the men there that your mother is finished working for them." He stood up then, the transition from the kneeling king back to the Iron Boss happening in a single, fluid motion. He looked down at his ruined trousers and the dust on his sleeves, but he didn't brush it off. He turned to Jean, his expression returning to a mask of lethal intent, though his eyes burned with a new, righteous fire. "Cancel the meeting with the developers," Han commanded, his voice slicing through the stillness. "Bring the cars around. We're going to the garment district. It's time I saw exactly what my name is being used for." As he walked away, the crowd parted for him with even more urgency than before, but the fear was different now. It was laced with a dawning, confused respect. Han didn't look back, his mind was already miles away, tracing the path to the factory where a mother was waiting for a miracle she had bought for $5. The black sedan glided through the city's industrial veins, the sleek lavender of Mr. Han's reflection in the window obscured by the thickening soot of the garment district. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocatingly quiet. Han did not look at his phone, he did not check the stock tickers that usually dictated his heartbeat. Instead, he pulled the crumpled $5 bill from his pocket, smoothing it against his silk-clad thigh. "Jean," Han said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the car's reinforced frame. "I want the real ledgers. Not the ones the accountants polish for the board. I want the production logs from the factory with the gray smoke." Jean nodded, his fingers flying across a tablet. Within moments, the unseen machine began to reveal its jagged teeth. As the data scrolled by, Han saw the efficiency he had once praised for what it truly was, a systematic grinding of human lives. The garment factory was running 20-hour shifts. The overhead reduction was actually the removal of ventilation and basic medical supplies. Most damning were the disciplinary logs, names of women who had been fined their entire day's wage for the crime of slowing down due to exhaustion. The car slowed as it entered the shadow of a monolithic concrete structure that belched a steady, sickly stream of gray smoke into the sky. This was the heart of his empire's most profitable sector, a place he had never bothered to visit because the numbers had always looked so perfect on paper. He had been a man blinded by his own success, a leader who had mistaken the silence of the oppressed for the peace of a well-run machine. Han stepped out of the vehicle, the acrid scent of chemical dyes and burning coal stinging his nostrils. He looked at the rusted gates and the armed guards, his guards, who stood watch not to keep the world out, but to keep the workers in. His lavender suit was a stark, almost garish contrast to the bleak, colorless landscape of the district. "They work for me," Han whispered, the realization tasting like ash. "And she paid me $5 to save them from myself." With Jean trailing closely behind, Han walked toward the entrance. He wasn't there to sign a contract or tour a facility, he was there to break the very machine he had spent a decade perfecting. Jean followed a half-step behind, his sunglasses masking eyes that were constantly recalibrating to a man he no longer fully recognized. In the decade he had served as Mr. Han's shadow, the world had been simple, there were assets to protect and obstacles to remove. He was used to a boss whose heart was a fortress of cold logic, a man who viewed the city as a series of numbers and strategic gains. But as they walked toward the heavy iron doors of the factory, Jean saw the iron boss waver. He watched the way Han's fingers twitched near the breast pocket of his lavender suit, where the crumpled $5 bill now rested like a lead weight. Usually, Han's stride was a lethal rhythm of confidence, but now there was a heavy, deliberate pause in his steps. For the first time, Jean didn't see a predator hunting, he saw a man haunted by the reflection of his own empire. The bodyguard felt a flicker of his own internal friction. His training demanded he focus on the armed guards at the gate, men who were technically on their own payroll but who looked nervous at the sudden arrival of the high command. Yet, his attention kept drifting back to Han's profile. He saw the sharp jawline tighten as a group of workers, faces gray with dust and eyes hollowed by exhaustion, shuffled past them toward a side exit. Han's gaze lingered on their stained hands, his expression shifting from calculated coldness to a raw, simmering fury that Jean had never seen fueled by anything other than business. Jean realized then that they weren't just walking into a factory, they were walking into a confrontation with the very foundation of Han's power. He wondered if this was a momentary lapse in his boss's legendary ruthlessness or a permanent fracture in the Iron Boss's armor. If Han softened, the vultures in the city would notice. If he turned against his own profit margins, the empire would tremble. "Sir," Jean rumbled, his voice a low warning that served as a reminder of the world they occupied. "The managers will be expecting a report on the quarterly increase. Not a rescue." Han didn't look at him. He simply reached into his pocket, his hand brushing against the $5 contract that had changed everything. "The report they gave me was a lie, Jean," Han replied, his voice a quiet storm. "I didn't come here to read. I came to settle a debt." With a nod from Han, Jean stepped forward to force open the doors, his duty to his boss unchanged, even as he realized the man he was protecting was no longer the man he had started the day with. The iron doors groaned as they swung open, releasing a wave of heat that carried the acrid stench of chemical dye and the suffocating scent of scorched fabric. Mr. Han stepped into the cavernous hall, his lavender suit a jarring anomaly against the backdrop of gray soot and fluorescent hum. The rhythm of the factory was a mechanical heartbeat, the relentless click-clack of thousands of sewing machines drowning out the sound of human breath. As he walked deeper into the labyrinth of workbenches, the reality of the efficiency he had once praised struck him like a physical blow. The air was thick with lint that clung to the sweaty brows of women whose spines were bent into permanent curse over their machines. There were no fans, no open windows, only the dim, flickering light of a system designed to extract every drop of vitality for a decimal point on a balance sheet. Han stopped at a central station where the fabric was piled high, looking at the hands of the workers. They were stained deep indigo and crimson, the skin cracked and bleeding from hours of repetitive motion. He saw a woman no older than 30 struggle to thread a needle, her fingers shaking with the same rhythmic tremor he had seen in Yumi's hands that morning. She didn't look up as he passed. Her world had been reduced to the narrow strip of cloth beneath her needle, her eyes hollowed by a fatigue that transcended sleep. Jean moved beside him, his presence a silent shield, but even the stoic bodyguard seemed affected by the sheer scale of the misery. The walls were plastered with productivity requirements signed with Han's own corporate seal, a seal that now felt like a brand of shame. Han realized that every thread in his own expensive wardrobe was woven with the desperation of people like Yumi's mother. He wasn't just a businessman anymore, he was a witness to his own crimes. In the distance, an overseer's whistle shrieked, a sharp, ugly sound that demanded even more speed from the exhausted crowd. Han's gaze followed the sound to a raised platform where a man in a stained shirt stood, clutching a clipboard and a scowl. The overseer hadn't noticed the man in the lavender suit yet, preoccupied with screaming at a woman who had dared to pause to wipe the sweat from her eyes. Han reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled $5 bill. The Iron Boss was gone. In his place stood a man whose soul had been bought by a child's savings, and he was finally ready to tear the machine apart. The overseer's voice cut through the mechanical drone like a jagged blade, his insults raining down on a woman whose head was bowed so low it nearly touched the needle of her machine. He didn't see the shadow stretching across the concrete floor until the air around him turned ice cold. When he finally turned, his sneer died instantly. Standing before him was a man in a lavender suit, his presence so lethal and out of place that the entire row of sewing machines fell into a ghostly, staggered silence. "Production is down." "Who are you two?" the overseer began, his bravado faltering as his eyes traveled from Han's polished shoes to the terrifyingly calm expression on his face. Behind Han, Jean stood like a monument of impending doom, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the overseer's throat. Han didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I am the man whose name is on the front of this building," he said, his tone a quiet, low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the factory. "And I am the man who is ending your employment." The overseer paled, his clipboard trembling. "Mr. Han." "Sir, I was just maintaining the quotas you set. We've increased output by 15% this." "You increased output by stealing the breath from children's mothers," Han interrupted, stepping onto the raised platform. The height advantage the overseer had enjoyed moments ago vanished. Han reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill, holding it up between two fingers like a piece of evidence in a capital murder trial. "I have already been paid to handle this. Your quotas mean nothing to me now. Your cruelty, however, has become a personal debt." Han looked at the man's name tag, then back into his panicked eyes. "Jean, escort this man out. Ensure he never finds work in this city again. If he ever sets foot near a factory floor, deal with him as we deal with those who steal from the family." Jean moved with a blurred efficiency, gripping the overseer by the scruff of his neck and hoisting him off the platform. The man's protests were muffled as he was dragged toward the iron doors, his boots scraping uselessly against the soot-stained floor. As the doors slammed shut behind them, a profound stillness settled over the room. Hundreds of women looked up from their machines, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. Han turned back to the crowd, his gaze softening as it landed on a woman in a gray-streaked apron near the front. The woman whose daughter had braved the city's most dangerous man with a whisper. He realized then that the $5 in his hand had bought more than just a firing, it had bought the first spark of his own redemption. Han stepped down from the platform, his lavender suit a sharp contrast to the dull machinery as he moved through the silent rows of workers. He wasn't looking at the production lines or the quotas anymore, he was looking for a face that matched the desperate hope he had seen in the square. He found her at a back station, her head resting against the cold metal of her sewing machine, her hands, stained with the dark dyes of his empire, trembling even in her exhaustion. "Mrs. Han?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of the edge that usually commanded the city. The woman flinched, her eyes fluttering open with a look of practiced terror. She saw the gold chain and the tailored suit, but as she looked up, she didn't see the Iron Boss. She saw a man holding a crumpled $5 bill in a way that suggested it was the most important document he had ever signed. "Your daughter sent me," he said simply, reaching out to steady her as she tried to stand. "She told me you were tired. She told me it was time for you to come home." A sob broke from the woman's throat, a sound of pure, raw relief that echoed through the hollow factory. Han didn't wait for her to gather her meager belongings. He draped his own lavender jacket over her thin, shivering shoulders, a gesture that signaled to every person in that building that the old rules were dead. With Jean clearing a path through the stunned workers, Han personally guided her toward the exit. As they reached the heavy iron doors, the sunlight broke through the gray smoke of the district, hitting them with a warmth that felt like a beginning. Han helped her into the back of his black sedan, the same car that had once represented his cold detachment from the world. He looked at Jean, a silent understanding passing between them. The rescue wasn't just about one woman, it was about the man he was becoming. "Take her to the clinic first," Han commanded, his hand resting on the car door. "Then take her to Yumi. Tell them the contract is fulfilled." As the car pulled away, Han stood alone in the soot of the garment district, his shirt sleeves rolled up, finally breathing air that no longer tasted like ash. The following morning, the high-rise boardroom was cold, the air thick with the unspoken judgment of men who measured life in margins. Mr. Han sat at the head of the table, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the tattoos of a past he had once used to intimidate the world. Across from him, his senior associates exchanged uneasy glances, their ledgers open to the plummeting production numbers from the garment district. They saw the soot still clinging to his shoes and the absence of his lavender jacket as signs of a catastrophic lapse in judgment. "The numbers are bleeding," Han, one associate ventured, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "You shut down 3 lines, fired our most productive overseer, and turned a profit center into a charity ward. The street thinks you've gone soft. They think the Iron Boss has melted." Han didn't flinch. He leaned forward, the gold chain around his neck catching the sterile office light, and placed a single object in the center of the mahogany table, the crumpled $5 bill. The tiny piece of paper looked absurdly small against the expensive surroundings, yet it commanded the room's attention like a live grenade. "I was paid $5 to realize that we were building a kingdom on top of a graveyard," Han said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that silenced the room. "We spent a decade perfecting a machine that turns human breath into silk. That machine is dead. From this moment on, we don't just move capital, we move people out of the dark." He laid out the new directives with the same cold precision he had once used to plan hits. The factories were to be gutted and rebuilt with proper light, air, and wages that didn't require a mother to choose between her health and her child's future. He wasn't giving up his power, he was weaponizing it for legitimacy. He made it clear that anyone who preferred the old ways, anyone who thought cruelty was the only path to strength, was free to leave, provided they could survive the departure. Gene stood by the door, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, but his posture was more relaxed than it had been in years. He saw the associates shrink back, realizing that Han hadn't lost his edge, he had simply sharpened it for a different kind of war. Han was no longer interested in being the most feared man in the city, he was becoming the most powerful man in the city, and he was starting by cleaning the blood off his own hands. Weeks later, the industrial district no longer belched the thick, suffocating gray smoke that had once signaled the slow destruction of families. The unseen machine had been dismantled and rebuilt, and while the city's skyline remained unchanged, the soul of Mr. Han's empire had been fundamentally altered. In his high-rise office, the air was quiet, devoid of the sterile coldness that had defined his reign as the Iron Boss. Han sat at his mahogany desk, no longer wearing the lavender suit that had served as a warning to the world. He looked down at a small, gold-framed object resting prominently beside his digital terminals and ledgers. Inside the glass was a single, crumpled $5 bill, its edges softened by the desperate grip of a 6-year-old girl named Yumi. To any other businessman, it was a pittance. To Han, it was the most expensive contract he had ever fulfilled. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Gene entered, but he didn't move with the rigid, lethal tension of a bodyguard expecting a hit. He stood with a newfound ease, nodding toward the window. Below in the square, the dark sedans were gone, replaced by the natural rhythm of a city no longer holding its breath in fear. Mrs. Han had returned home, her health restored and her hands no longer stained by the indigo dyes of a predatory system. Han had ensured she was given a legitimate role in his new, ethical enterprise, a move that had signaled a cleansing of his entire organization. Han reached out and traced the edge of the gold frame. He had spent his life accumulating millions, thinking power was measured by how much one could take. He now understood that true authority was measured by what one could protect. The bill served as a permanent reminder that even the most guarded heart has a price, and sometimes, redemption costs only $5. He was no longer just a boss, he was a man who had been bought back from the brink of his own darkness. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across his desk, the Iron Boss looked at the framed note one last time before turning to the work of building a kingdom where children like Yumi would never have to buy their mother's lives again.